That's it for the news. And now a conversation with Farid Khan about International Religious Freedom Day in Canada. Welcome to the show, Farid. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Last week, we celebrated something called International Religious Freedom Day. I had a look on the internet and learned that this seems to be a day that the United States founded a few years ago, and other countries follow it. So do you have a sense of why Canada is also observing International Religious Freedom Day?
Well, I think one of the reasons is to be in line with its allies, but I also think that given the state of religious persecution in different parts of the world, it's a day that Canada has adopted to call attention to minorities who are being persecuted, Muslims, Christians, and others.
So you think that Canada has a commitment to these values and that's why they want to celebrate it? Is that for you the main point of the day?
Well, I think that's part of it, but it's also, I think, an opportune day to call attention to what's happening to minorities in other countries. So, for example, what's happening to Uyghurs in China, what's happening to Rohingya in Myanmar, and also what's happening to Muslims in India and in Kashmir. So it seems that in calling attention to this day, one of the things we're doing is calling attention to the fact that right now around the world, Muslims are one of the most persecuted religious minorities where they hold minority status outside of certain democratic countries.
And when I talk to some Christian interfaith groups, they'll say that Christians are suffering the most persecution around the world, and they often place the blame at Muslims. What's your sense of that?
Well, yes, Christians are being persecuted, but it's not just Muslims who are persecuting them. Certainly in Pakistan, Christians are facing persecution. Coptic Christians, of course, are facing certain levels of persecution in Egypt. But if you look in terms of sheer numbers, it is Muslims. I mean, in India, Christians are being persecuted and China as well. But in terms of sheer numbers, Muslims are the biggest faith community that is being targeted where they are minorities.
Right. I'll come back to that if we have time at the end, but in terms of Canada protecting religious freedom inside its own borders, how satisfied are you with how Canada upholds religious freedom?
Well, I think outside of Quebec, it's generally good. Canada is defending religious freedom. However, in the case of Quebec, Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs, basically visible minority, racialized religious minorities who visibly display their faith, are under assault by a provincial government that has taken on quasi-fascist overtones. Bill 21 is their secularism law, which is meant to preserve secularism according to them. But in fact, it doesn't do that. What it does is it actually tries to force religious minorities in that province to abandon their faith if they work for certain positions in the government, like judges, police officers, and teachers. So with the exception of what's happening in Quebec, yes, it's generally good, but we have this very serious problem in the province of Quebec where all three faith communities, but particularly Muslims, are being targeted, and the Canadian government is not doing anything to prevent that from happening.
I know that you're a human rights advocate and you've been working on issues of Muslim persecution overseas. Have you also been involved in advocating on this issue in Quebec, Bill 21?
Yes, I have. I have spoken out on it. I have written op-eds that have been published. I have done media interviews. This is a very dangerous thing that is happening in Quebec. It is similar to what was happening to Jews in Nazi Germany in the early 1930s. And the fact that the Liberal government, as well as the Conservatives, and certainly the Bloc Québécois, and even the NDP have said that this is a provincial matter. It does not bode well, because what it says is that we will only defend religious minorities when it is politically convenient. And in this election, last federal election, Bill 21 did come up But once again, we had the Federalist parties, the three main Federalist parties, instead of standing together and saying, no, this is wrong, we will not allow this to happen, they basically caved in. And that's very dangerous. And I think that not just in Quebec, but across Canada, Canadians should be very worried about this.
You have likened it to the situation of Jews in the lead up, I guess, in the Weimar Republic, in the lead up to what happened, the horrors that happened after. And yet you're saying during the election, the parties decided just to leave it to the provinces. Why do you think it is that they don't see it in the same terms as important and dangerous as you do, or as many Muslims do?
Well, it's sheer political expediency. Quebec has the second largest block of seats in the House of Commons, and all three parties want to try and make political gains in that province against the Bloc Québécois, which got the second largest number of seats. And they decided to sacrifice human rights on the altar of political expediency. And this goes against the much vaunted claims that this Liberal government has made since it was elected in 2015. That is, it is a defender of human rights and the rule of law. And what we see in Quebec is anything but that with respect to Bill 21.
So that's kind of like a hypocrisy then, celebrating International Religious Freedom Day, but not doing something to bring about religious freedom for Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs in Quebec.
Oh, it's blatant hypocrisy. And I am waiting to see whether there's going to be anything in the throne speech about this issue, because it is an issue that continues to destroy lives. People are having to move from Quebec in order to pursue certain careers, and that should not be the case anywhere in Canada.
Do you attribute the same forces that you've mentioned, political expediency and votes and things? They also established last month a permanent office called the Special Envoy of Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, headed up by former Member of Parliament Erwin Kotler. The National Canadian Council Muslims, when they called for this summit on Islamophobia, called for a special envoy as well to be appointed on Islamophobia, and that hasn't happened yet. And I haven't heard any statements about that they're taking proactive steps to creating such an office. Do you have any inside knowledge on that?
Well, we're still in the early days. We've only had the cabinet appointed a couple of weeks ago. And if there is going to be anything said about doing that, it will likely, the first place it will be said would be in the throne speech. And so I think a lot of people, a lot of Muslims are eagerly anticipating what will be contained in that speech. And I imagine that the National Council of Canadian Muslims is in communication with the newly appointed Minister of Diversity and Inclusion, Ahmed Hussein, to try and make sure that this happens. I support it. I think many Muslims support, given the fact that Muslims have been the only faith community in Canada who have been killed as a result of hate and bigotry and racism. And if the federal government, if the Liberals government decides not to do this, then there will literally be hell to pay for them politically.
And I just want to be clear, because these issues can get very sensitive and blow up in wrong ways. By calling for an office on a special envoy on Islamophobia, we're not taking away at all from the need for one on anti-Semitism. We know that hate crimes against Jews are very high in Canada too. And we're not trying to pit one group against another. We're just trying to point out that this office has been created for one group and there's another group that also needs something similar.
Well, no, it's not a it's not anything to diminish what Jews are facing. But you know, when you look at what's happened in Canada, the targeting of Muslims, the blatant Islamophobia, we've seen the fact that 11 people have been killed, 11 Muslims have been killed in acts of hate. And there's been a huge increase in acts of Islamophobia, violent Islamophobia across the country. When you see what is happening around the world to Muslims who are minorities in certain countries, then it only makes sense for the government to appoint such an envoy.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, and I did want to leave room and come back to your assessment of the Canadian government's response to the human rights abuses that are happening against Muslims as minorities that you mentioned previously. How well do you think they're doing?
I would have to give them, if I had to grade them on a report card, I'd have to give them a D. Because, first of all, we barely heard the issue of Islamophobia or racism mentioned during the federal election by any of the party leaders. Yes, it was included in the platforms of both the NDP and the Liberals, but it was not discussed in any major way. We've seen a lot of so-called thoughts and prayers type of statements, but we need concrete actions. Hate and racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ bigotry and hate has been on the rise. It is growing. White supremacy has been on the rise and it's been growing. And it needs to be addressed in concrete ways with a leadership approach from the national level, the same way that the government led nationally on the COVID-19 pandemic. Hate is a pandemic in this country, and it needs to be addressed in exactly the same manner that COVID-19 was addressed, and I'm hoping to see that in this new parliament.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show today and sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So you've been watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe and God bless.